Okay, so this is part 2 of the DHCP demonstrations. And what we did yesterday was we took this machine and it was at .77, that's a Windows 7, and Windows 8 machine was at .88. And then we had the DHCP server. We installed it and we put in, and we should put in here that our address pool is from 0.01 to 0.20. Now 0.01 is the server's number and it's always going to stay that server's number. But we ended up with this guy was at 0.2 and this was at 0.3. So we turned off the system and turned it back on this morning. And so what we have here is, if we look at our server, and the way this works is that you have a lease for a week, but now that lease runs continuously if you do not turn off the computer. Every time you turn off your computer and then turn it back on, it reboots and you get a new number from the DHCP server. So now today the Windows 7 machine is at 0.2 and the Windows 8 is at 0.3. And that's no big deal. Every time you turn it off and turn it back on, it's going to get a new number, presumably. I mean, it can have the same number from day to day, but you can also make reservations, and that's what this is, reservations that will always give a client the same IP address. And, you know, some of the options, what we do in that is we say, hey, the DNS server is always going to be our server, and we're going to use the server as a router. So if you always wanted a certain computer to have a certain address, you can do that, and you can set that up. So what we're going to show today, well, a couple things. I guess number one is, what happens when you try to turn on, and if we go to the network, every time we turn off the computer, it's going to have to ask for another IP address when you turn it back on, and it boots up the system. And in fact, sometimes that DHCP protocol is called bootp, and that's part of the process when you boot up your computer, is it asks for an IP address. Now, in Microsoft products, they also have a way for, if this DHCP server, for some reason, it can't communicate, then it automatically assigns one to itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you what happens. And we're going to take our Windows 8 machine, and we're first going to power this off. And when it gets powered off inside the virtual machines, it looks like this. Now the second thing we're going to do is we're going to go over to our server and we're going to deactivate the scope. So what that'll do is now it'll prevent clients from obtaining the IP address, and we're going to do that. Now if you look really hard, and it's kind of hard to see, but down here there's a little red dot, and that kind of signifies that the scope is off. Now also, if you just right click on the scope, it'll say activate, and that's because it's deactivated right now. If it was active and you right clicked it, it would say, you know, deactivate. Anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to turn back our Windows 8 machine and we watch what happens, because now what it's going to do is it's going to go through the boot process, but it's not going to be able to obtain a DHCP address from the DHCP server. So there is this Microsoft process where it can obtain one independent of the DHCP server. And what happens, and we can kind of go here, what happens in this condition when this DHCP server is temporarily offline is it's going to get its own address, but now the address it will get will not be the same. It will not be in the 10.0.0 network, and that's what our network wants to be. So this computer and any other computer that would turn on while this was off is going to be in a different network. So if you find that for some reason, there can be a lot of reasons a computer can't talk to the internet, and our internet will be somewhere out here, and later what we'll do is we'll have this server set up as a router so it can talk through our host computer into the internet. But if this computer wasn't able to talk to the internet, but all these were, one of the problems could be that it was not able to obtain the proper IP address from the DHCP server. So if we go back here and we're about ready to fire up our Windows 8 machine, we can see what happens. Put in our password. And during this whole boot up process is when it has been trying to obtain an IP address. So if we go to our desktop, and again, we go into the network and sharing, and we right click on that, and we go to our network and sharing center. And down here you can see that we're not connected to the internet right now, but we will take care of that later. And if we can get up here, now this will say, what is our Ethernet connection? And we go into details. Now it went through and it got an auto configuration IP address. And now this is in the network. This is the Microsoft auto configuration IP address. And it always begins 169.254. And the other thing we want to look at, oh, and while we look at these details, another thing is DHCP is enabled because it tries to go to the DHCP server. The DHCP server is just not responsive. So it's still enabled, but it's not working. But now down here, we have no default gateway. We have no DNS server. Now we really didn't do anything with the Win server. But the point is, if this computer isn't working and can't get through to the internet, it can't get through because it doesn't know a default gateway, and it doesn't know a DNS server, so it has no way of talking. Now if we go back and we look at the server end, and we look at our address leases, now it still thinks that the Windows 8 machine has the address of 10.0.0.3 because that's what it had previously. And the server has no knowledge of when computers turn themselves off and turn themselves back on. And it really doesn't know until it finalizes the process of what computer has one address. So really, and because it's now not active, it didn't know that it was going through the process. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our scope and right click it, and we're going to reactivate it. So now our scope is once again active and the red dot is gone. And if we look at the leases, we still have those leases. Now another thing, when you look at leases, it's always good to use this refresh button. And now this says, this one, it only has the number 2 address active. So when you activate it and refresh it, it'll say, well, nobody's got that address, because what happened was the Windows 8 machine released that address when it got the private address. So if we go back into the Windows 8 machine, into the network and sharing, what we can do is we can just once again look and verify, yeah, it's still got the 169. Now that the DHCP is active, we're going to connect it back into the network. And to do that, you have to get into the command line and go into the command prompt. And the IP config is the main command that lets you look at what the IP address configurations is. The config all tells you all the information that you can get out of it. And let's try to make the window bigger. Go to the top. It'll say what the host name is. This is Windows 8.1. It shows that we're in the helping up local domain. But now it says down here, is DHCP enabled? Yes. And then it has this auto configuration enabled. And now the auto configuration address is 169.254, and then these we don't really care about. Now another thing, if we know that the DHCP server is back on, what we can do is, instead of IP config all, what we do is we release, and that's going to release the IP address that it had automatically obtained, and it says that the it's disconnected. So then what we do, instead of release, now we go back and say we want to renew. And this goes back to the DHCP server and says, I want to get my address from you. Now it takes a few seconds for the process to take care of itself, but if we do this, and if we go back into the network sharing, look at our Ethernet connection and our details, now we are back into the 10.0.0.3 network. So now, if we look at this, when it had the individual thing, it was in a 169 network. So now it cannot communicate with anybody. It is a computer on an island by itself. But now that we released it from that and renewed it, now it's back in this network, and it can communicate with all these computers. And again, we're not set up right now to communicate out into the internet, but we'll do that later. And we'll show that in a video. And finally, so we're okay at this end. Let's take another look at where we are at the computer end. I need to heed my advice. You can go in these administrative tools and go right into DHCP. And this will get us into our helping up mission, and we want to get into the I4. Then we want to get into, if we look at our scope, this will tell us the address pool is 1 to 20, and if we make this window a little bit bigger, that'll tell us we're in our HUM1 network. And then if we look at our leases right now, and if we refresh it, and I'm not sure why this is bad address, because that's our server address. That should not be a bad address. But 10.0.0.2 is our Windows 7 machine, and 0.0.3 is now our Windows 8 machine. So now we're back to our former configuration. And this was just a little demonstration of auto configuration address, and that will create problems, and you need to be aware of that. So that's the second demonstration. The third demonstration, we're going to talk about a little bit about what we actually have in this virtual network and how we connect everything up virtually, and then how we're going to attempt to connect it on the output, because right now we have all these connected with virtual network cards. We're going to put a second virtual network card in the server so it can connect through our computer, the real hardware, and out into the internet. And that'll be the third demonstration.